What's up, booktube? It's Monty here, and today I would like to talk about my Friday reads that I got to or didn't get to because that was a hot fucking mess. I can only blame myself though because I did not make reading a priority in the same way that I probably should have. But I don't regret it. I'm not about that regret life, so it's not something I'm going to be sticking to now. So I didn't read anything in My Brother's Husband. It just wasn't something I got to because the Song of Achilles. I don't want to go into too much detail, but let's just say there was something that happened, and it kind of threw me for a loop. And I was like, you know what? It's the Iliad. It's a retelling of Greek myth. This sort of a thing happens in Greek myth. I'll go with it. And then Patroclus slept with the person, and I was like, now you just know what that person did to Achilles, and you're gonna sleep with them. Like you're gonna do like that. Like that's what's gonna happen here. Okay, and then there just was a bunch of unnecessary. I'm not connecting with the writing. It's just not happening. But it was really the Patroclus sleeping with this person he did not need to be sleeping with after he found out this information that really just kind of ruined my reading weekend. But I do want to come with a quick tea and thoughts, and I say quick because I'm out of actually, this is empty because I filmed this like 10 times. So I've consumed all of that. But I do have some thoughts, and it was basically me watching some like just some previous content that had been released by a bunch of booktubers about LGBT representation in young adult fiction, and how most of it, and I do agree with this point, I do agree that most LGBT fiction in young adults is of queer men, and it is with them with other queer men. I do think that is sort of the standard. But what I wanted to add to this conversation, and I think that the way that I can add it in the most concise sort of jumping off point, is that while it's undeniable that the queer men are hypervisible in young adult fiction, I think that it's important that when we have that discussion about queer stories in general, much like when we're talking about Black stories or Latinx stories or Asian representation in young adult fiction, is to consider one, who it's coming from, because a lot of the hypervisibility of queer men comes from authors who are not queer men. You have people like Cassandra Clare, who has used Alex and Magnus in her, the 6 books and the Mortal Instruments. You need to consider who it's coming from. Like Becky Albertalli's Simon vs. Homo Sapiens Agenda, the Raven Cycle is more women. Carry On, I think, is probably the second worst, marginally better than Cassandra Clare, but I think it still plays into a lot of tropey, fanfiction-y, like, things that don't work. And yes, I understand that Carry On is meant to be the fanfiction writing of another person from a series that you don't have to look into to read, but I don't think that excuses the relationship depicted there. Like, I understand that it's a Harry Draco wrong. Like, I understand. I get it. Like, I am here. I get it. But I don't think that it worked. I don't think it was successful as queer rep. But those big major works from 4 major authors, I can't really go into the rep in the Raven Cycle because I only read the first 2 books, and Ronin sexuality is discussed in book 2, but it's not in a sort of important narrative there, and I didn't really care. It's not anything against it. It's just that you have to consider that these are 4 books written by women who aren't queer men, and they're the most hyped books. I think the only book that's written by a man, and I don't even know if Benjamin is queer, is Dante and Aristotle. Adam Silvera's books, I would say, are hyped. I would consider them hyped, but they have far less ratings and reviews on Goodreads. At least They Both Die at the End, which I think is his most recent. Well, technically, What If It's Us is his most recent work, but I feel like that one's probably a little bit more hyped just because it was written with Becky Albertalli. But coincidentally, I think that What If It's Us is his worst book, so I don't care if it's the most hyped. But I feel like you have to consider the fact that these hyped books are not coming from queer people. This is kind of an epic love story, again written by a queer person of color, black, bisexual, pansexual. He was a queer man who had a relationship with a queer Latinx man, and they had LGBT friends that they associated with. I think it was probably the best book I've read that featured LGBT people, because it featured friendships with LGBT people. But again, that has less than 1,000 ratings on Goodreads. It has less than, I think, 300 reviews. So when we have this narrative of, oh, queer male stories are hyper visible, yes, that is true. But you have to consider that these are coming from authors who are already hyped. Like, these are books being written and published by people who already have a community that is following them. We need to consider that these aren't always own voice narratives. These aren't always the best depiction of queer men. Sometimes, like in Cassandra Clare's case, they are incredibly harmful to queer men, especially queer men of color. How queer men are hyper visible in terms of YA fiction. It's important to understand that just because they're hyper visible doesn't always mean that the depiction is accurate or sympathetic or even beneficial to the queer community. But also, it's important to recognize that when we talk about them being hyper visible, often it is in relation to hyped properties that exist on a different level than just I don't want to say a normal book, but from 99% of the books that are written. Not every book that features queer men is hyped in the same way that Simon Versus is, or Carry On was, or the Raven Cycle gets pushed on people, or the Mortal Instrument series gets pushed on people. Most queer stories, both that feature lesbian or transgender or gender non-conforming or pansexual or asexual, whatever is in the umbrella, like whatever it is, like most books don't get that huge marketing push. And so while it's easy to be like, oh, we need diversity, throw in a black person, we need diversity, throw in a gay character, fine, like somebody thinks like that. Some author out there is thinking that way. But it's also important to realize that when I did my January my January library haul video, most of those books featured queer characters. 5 of them, I would say, were probably hyped. The 2 Sean Davids, the 2 Adam Silveras, and Aristotle and Dante. I had never heard of the other ones. So I think that it's important to be like, yes, it's probably the easiest to find queer male stories in young adult fiction and in movies and television. It's easiest to see those stories being rewarded in ways that other communities aren't. I think the conversation is often, we have enough queer male characters, we need these other things. And am I biased as a queer male person? Yes. As a gay man, I am biased in favor of more gay male stories. Not even gay, but just queer male relationships. Like, I will always be biased in favor of that. It's just an intrinsic part of my being, an intrinsic part of what I like to read about. I think that it's unhelpful to be like, we have enough. We have these 5 really hyped books, we have enough. Because I think that's really what it is. We focus on these hyped books, which is what we do in general on BookTube, and just, like I said, in general in life. Like, you'll find these properties, like these really big television shows, and you'll be like, well, the gays have those shows, like, we don't need any more. And so while I think it's important to bring up other aspects and other people in other communities that are underrepresented, I think that the conversation isn't benefited by saying we have enough, they're hyper visible, like, they're good. I think that's really what I'm trying to say, and what I hope I got across. So I didn't read this weekend. Queer men are hyper visible in media in general, but especially on BookTube and in young adult fiction. And yes, we do need more stories of people in the LGBTQIA+ community, but that doesn't mean that because we have hyped books, that's it. I think that and it does a disservice to think that way. I don't think that it's an either or situation. I think that you can want both things. And I do want to say that going forward, I will be doing a better job of trying to read more diversely inside the LGBTQIA plus community, to be looking for more than just queer men. Especially because those books just don't get the hype that the queer men do. But again, not all hype is good hype. And I really want to be like, that's sort of like the other takeaway. Not all hype is good hype, and it's not an either or situation. I'm gonna go now because my throat is hella fucking dry. But I hope that we really have a discussion about this in the comment section, and on if you can find me on Twitter. All those kinds of links will be down below. And I'll see you again when I see you. But until then, bye.